Hi, I'm Sania Rao with the Capital Forum, and joining me is Katrina Robson from Willkie, and Gallagher. Thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Guys, for starters, Katrina, it's such an important topic, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on the merger guidelines and some of the big takeaways that stood out to you.
Sure. So I think one of the most substantial changes that we saw between the draft version and the final version is that in the draft version, the FTC took a much more deliberate tone in saying mergers should not. And in the revised version, they came back and said mergers may violate the law when. That change, in combination with the fact that they moved the discussion of the rebuttal evidence from an appendix into the main text, I think has some real force to it with respect to what's happening there. So courts typically approach these questions under the merger guidelines, whether a merger should be blocked, by going through a very deliberate set of processes. So it's, did the government establish a prima facie case? Did the defendants come back with a rebuttal case? Then once that burden shifts back to the government, did the government prove its contentions by a preponderance of the evidence? By making that change where they said that mergers may not, and moving that rebuttal evidence up into the text of the final revised guidelines, I think the government actually made those guidelines more accessible to courts. It looks a little bit closer to the process that a court will follow.
We talked about courts a little. I'd love to know your thoughts a little further about how you see courts responding to them. We have the first suit filed under the new merger guidelines. So what are your thoughts on how the court might respond here, or even generally?
Right, so courts for decades, well, not quite decades, but since 2010, courts have generally looked to the merger guidelines as an informative source, right? This is how the agency approaches looking at mergers, and they take a look at it and they consider that in the course of making their decision. Now, typically, if we go back to 2010, the 2010 horizontal guidelines, I think, hewed a little bit closer to case law as it existed. Whereas these revised merger guidelines, I think, reflect more of what the agencies would like the antitrust law to be. So I think courts will approach this with a slightly more nuanced consideration. The court is going to make the decision about whether the merger is legal or illegal under Section 7 of the Clayton Act. And I think they'll take into account the fact that in these particular guidelines, the agencies are actually, to some extent, arguing for some changes to the law.
Absolutely. How does this change your approach with clients and conversations and questions from clients?
Well, I think one of the main questions I get from clients is, will a court actually take these revised merger guidelines and consider them authoritative? Like, is this essentially the case I'm going to have to make to the court as well as to the agencies? So it's one of the really critical questions that they have. I think the second question they have is around predictability. Because the revised merger guidelines are more progressive, one of the things that occurs within that set of guidelines is that they've lowered some of the thresholds necessary to trigger potentially regulatory review. They've put into those guidelines some more what I would consider novel theories. By doing that, they've made more mergers subject to potentially investigation and litigation. Now, the agencies did this because they said they wanted to increase transparency so people would understand what the issues were. And I think it's very fair that is what they tried to do, and to some extent, they achieved that. But at the same time, there's a little bit of nuance to transparency in the sense that, did they make it more predictable? By making a larger set of mergers potentially subject to investigation and potentially litigation, they've increased the scope of the prosecutorial discretion. And so a lot of the questions that my clients have is around that predictability. Okay, I can see what the agencies might identify as an issue. They're clearly not going to bring a case every time they find one of these issues. Is my case going to fall into one of those, into an area of interest for them?
Thank you for breaking that down. Based on your experience, how has deal terms changed in recent years?
Well, I think this question around predictability is huge, right? There is, because of that lack of predictability, it injects uncertainty in the financial markets. And so as the the people who are negotiating these contracts and thinking about business terms, they have to take that into account as they actually set the terms for their deal. So there is a lot more conversation around timing, a lot more conversation around the antitrust risk and what that antitrust risk looks like and how they should address it and basically allocate it between the parties.
While we talk about risk, how should companies think about positioning remedies with regulators today?
Right. Well, that's a great question. I think if you look at the revised merger guidelines, one of the things that the agency has done is taken what I call a 360-degree view of a merger. They want to see that that merger strengthens competition or doesn't affect competition, one or the other, with respect to buyers, sellers, and labor. So it's three very different areas. They want to see that. They've also told us in these revised guidelines that there could be multiple overlapping markets. And they give the example of a food merger where, and I may not get this quite right, but it's a food merger where there may be multiple overlapping markets that cover cookies, chocolate chip cookies, low-fat chocolate chip cookies, and premium low-fat chocolate chip cookies.
Okay.
So if you think about it, what they're telling you is they really want that 360-degree view of what the effects of the merger will be, and they want to apply different lenses to that. So when I talk to my clients about things like remedies, we try to take that into account.
I know your background focuses, you've done a lot of airline-related cases. I'd love to talk to you at least a little bit about that. We saw the first big decision out there in a while, Spirit JetBlue. Can you walk me through some of the takeaways for you in that case?
So if we go back to the process that the judges use, Judge Young used a very familiar process. It was, did the government establish a prima facie case? Mm-hmm. Did the defendants come back with a rebuttal, meet the bar for a rebuttal? And then once the burden shifted back to the government, did they show by a preponderance of the evidence that that the court should block this merger? And when you take a look at the facts that he used as he followed that progression, they were very interesting. He starts off his decision actually by saying there are no bad guys here, and that both of these companies are acting in very economically rational ways. In fact, points out, if JetBlue grows, that's going to put more competitive pressure on other airlines. That would be a good thing, generally speaking. And he also acknowledged that there's some constraint to JetBlue being able to grow because there's a limitation on some of the inputs necessary for that, things like aircraft, right? So this merger made sense because it removed some of those constraints, which would allow JetBlue to grow. So what really caused him to move back to a position where he felt that the merger shouldn't go forward was a really interesting fact. He focused in on what he called Spirit loyal customers. In fact, he ends his opinion, I think it's close to this. For all the Spirit loyal customers out there, this one's for you. And in doing that, what he's really pointing to is the fact that Spirit has this business model where they have a very unbundled product. If you want to fly somewhere, you can buy just the seat. That's it. If later you decide that you want to add a bag or add two bags, you'll pay for it later, right? So the judge was putting some emphasis on that as actually a very good competitive thing, something that was going to benefit a number of consumers, where that loss was enough to actually trigger, in his conclusion, Section 7 of the Clayton Act.
Absolutely. How does the DOT's merger enforcement policies now change the communications that you have with clients?
So I would actually frame that more broadly.
Okay.
So President Biden, when he came into office, talked about the fact that he wanted a whole of government competition policy. And that means not just the DOT, but all kinds of actors, the FDIC, just across the board, the FCC, the Department of Agriculture. Yes. He wanted to see everyone working together to achieve vigorous competition. And after he said that, you saw a slew of memorandums of understandings appear between these agencies. So in my world, I enter joint defense agreements because joint defense agreements allow me to share information with other attorneys, and some of that communication is privileged. Memorandums of understanding have some analogous protections. So that means that these agencies are talking to each other about competitive issues. And to some extent, there is an argument, and I think the government would make it, that some of those communications are privileged. So what I find very interesting here is, do we have agencies that actually may have some disagreements about what the competitive effects of a certain action may be? And where they have disagreements about that, are we getting that information?
Absolutely. No, I thank you for breaking that down. And thank you for joining us today. This was super helpful.
Of course. Happy to do this.
Thank you.
Thank you.